Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The autumn mist clung to the Smoky Mountains like a shroud in October of 1904, wrapping the ancient peaks in layers of gray that obscured the narrow footpaths winding through eastern Tennessee. These mountains had witnessed generations of hardship, but none quite like the tragedy that would unfold in the isolated hollow where the Garrett sisters made their home. Martha Garrett, 26 years old, and her younger sister Caroline, 23, lived in a weathered cabin perched on a ridge overlooking one of the main footpaths that travelers used to cross the Appalachian wilderness. Their father had died 3 winters prior, crushed beneath a fallen tree while logging, and their mother had succumbed to pneumonia the following spring, leaving the sisters alone in a world that offered women few mercies and fewer opportunities. The cabin stood roughly 2 miles from the nearest settlement, a collection of perhaps 20 families that could barely be called a town. The structure itself spoke of decades of mountain life, built from chestnut logs that had darkened with age and weather, the gaps chinked with clay and moss. A stone chimney rose from one end, constantly smoking during the cold months, and a small porch sagged slightly on the west side where the foundation had settled unevenly. Inside, the sisters maintained what their mother had taught them, keeping the single room clean despite the constant intrusion of mountain dust and the smoke from the fireplace that never quite vented properly. 2 narrow beds occupied one corner, separated by a curtain their mother had sewn from flour sacks, while a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs comprised their dining area. Shelves held their meager possessions, mostly cooking implements, a few books their father had acquired over the years, and the family Bible that recorded births and deaths in fading ink. Martha possessed the severe beauty common to mountain women who had known hard work from childhood. Her face was angular, with high cheekbones and a strong jawline that gave her an almost predatory look when the light fell certain ways. Her hair, dark as coal, hung straight down her back when unpinned, but she typically wore it in a tight bun that emphasized the intensity of her gray eyes. Those eyes had developed a hardness over the years, a calculating quality that unsettled the few neighbors who still maintained contact with the sisters. Her hands showed the calluses and scars of mountain life, capable hands that could split wood, tend a garden, and dress game with equal efficiency. She stood taller than most women of her time, nearly 5 feet 8 inches, with a lean frame that suggested both strength and deprivation. Caroline presented a softer contrast to her older sister, though the years had begun to etch their own story on her features. Where Martha was angular, Caroline retained some roundness in her face, with fuller cheeks and lips that might have been called pretty under better circumstances. Her hair carried hints of auburn that caught the light, and her eyes were a lighter shade of gray, almost blue in certain conditions. She stood several inches shorter than Martha and possessed a fuller figure that their mother had once said would attract a good husband. But the mountain had few good husbands left, and those who remained had already married or showed no interest in women struggling alone on a failing homestead. The sisters survived through a combination of subsistence farming, occasional wage work when they could find it, and the charity of neighbors who grew increasingly reluctant as the months passed without seeing any improvement in the Garrett situation. Their small garden plot yielded potatoes, beans, and squash during the growing season, but the rocky mountain soil made agriculture challenging at best. They kept a few chickens that provided eggs when the hens weren't eaten by foxes or weasels, and they foraged extensively in the surrounding forest for nuts, berries, and edible plants. Martha had learned to set snares for rabbits and squirrels, providing occasional meat for their table, but game had grown scarce as more people competed for the same resources in these unforgiving mountains. The financial reality facing the sisters had become increasingly desperate as winter approached. Their father's death had left debts that creditors still occasionally came to collect, arriving on horseback with legal papers the sisters could barely read. The property itself held little value, the land too steep and rocky for serious farming, too remote for any commercial enterprise. They had sold what few valuable possessions the family owned during the first year of their parents' deaths: the ornate pocket watch their grandfather had carried, their mother's wedding ring, the rifle their father had treasured. What remained barely qualified as furniture, and the cabin itself leaked in multiple places when the rains came hard. Work opportunities for unmarried women in the Tennessee mountains of 1904 were virtually non-existent beyond the most menial tasks. The sisters occasionally found day labor during harvest season at larger farms down in the valley, backbreaking work in the sun that paid barely enough to buy flour and sugar. They took in washing when they could, standing over boiling pots for hours to clean the clothes of families slightly less poor than themselves, their hands raw and reddened from lye soap. Martha had tried her hand at weaving, creating rough baskets from white oak splits, but the market for such items had dried up as factory-made goods became more available even in these remote areas. The constant rejection, the closed doors, the expressions of pity mixed with contempt they encountered in the settlement had begun to transform something fundamental in Martha's character. The footpath that ran past their cabin saw regular traffic during the milder months, travelers making their way through the mountains for various reasons. Circuit preachers carrying the gospel to isolated communities, traveling salesmen with packs full of patent medicines and household goods, men seeking work in the lumber camps or coal mines that had begun operating deeper in the mountains, occasional government officials making surveys or collecting taxes, and sometimes families relocating to new homesteads or fleeing old debts. These travelers often stopped at the Garrett cabin, seeking water from the spring that bubbled up near the property, asking directions, or hoping for a meal in exchange for news from the wider world. The sisters had initially welcomed such visits, grateful for the company and the small amounts of money or goods some travelers offered in exchange for hospitality. Martha had begun to notice patterns in these encounters during the previous summer. Single men traveling alone, especially those who appeared to carry money or valuable goods, would often linger at the cabin longer than necessary. Their eyes would follow Caroline as she moved about, performing her chores, and they would sometimes make comments, suggestions, offers that ranged from marriage proposals to more temporary arrangements. Some of these men were crude, making their intentions explicitly clear. Others were more subtle, expressing concern for the sisters' situation, offering protection or partnership in terms that carried underlying implications. Martha watched these interactions with growing interest, seeing something her younger sisters seemed to miss, a potential resource they had not yet exploited. The transformation in Martha's thinking had occurred gradually over many months of increasing desperation. She had watched Caroline attract the attention of traveling men and had seen how their demeanor changed, how they became more generous, more willing to part with coins or goods when Caroline smiled at them or touched their arms while serving coffee. Martha had observed how men's rationality seemed to diminish in the presence of female attention, how they made poor decisions, how they revealed information about their possessions and plans that a more cautious person would keep private. These observations had planted seeds in Martha's mind, dark seeds that took root in the fertile ground of desperation and resentment that had been growing since their parents' deaths. By early September of 1904, Martha had begun to formulate a plan that would solve their financial problems permanently. The idea had come to her during a sleepless night when the weight of unpaid debts and approaching winter pressed down on her with crushing force. She had been thinking about a traveling salesman who had stopped by the previous week, a portly man with soft hands and expensive boots who had carried a sample case filled with jewelry and watches. He had stayed for dinner, paying generously and making obvious advances toward Caroline, his eyes lingering on her in ways that should have been offensive but instead had made Martha think of possibilities. The man had shown them his wares, gold watches and silver bracelets glittering in the lamplight, and had mentioned traveling alone through the mountains with thousands of dollars worth of inventory. He had been foolish enough to describe his route and his planned stops, information he would never have shared with men but seemed comfortable divulging to two supposedly helpless women. Martha had lain awake that night, thinking about how easy it would be, how the dense forest surrounding their cabin could swallow secrets, how the steep ravines that cut through the mountains claimed lives every year without any human intervention. She had thought about the desperate situation they faced, about the approaching winter, about the very real possibility of starvation or freezing to death in their drafty cabin. She had thought about the unfairness of their situation, how their father's death had not been his fault, how their mother's illness could not have been prevented, how the world had simply discarded them as inconvenient and unimportant. In that darkness, listening to Caroline's quiet breathing from the other side of the curtain, Martha had made a decision that would damn them both. The next morning, Martha had begun speaking to Caroline about their options, carefully, testing her sister's moral boundaries without revealing her full intentions. She had started with gentle suggestions, pointing out how certain travelers seemed to carry significant wealth, how isolated their cabin was, how no one would question if a traveler simply never emerged from the other side of the mountain. Caroline had initially resisted these conversations, uncomfortable with the implications, but Martha had been patient and persistent. She had emphasized their desperate situation, reminded Caroline of the creditors who might soon force them from the only home they had known, painted pictures of freezing winters and slow starvation. She had gradually normalized the idea of taking what they needed from those who could afford the loss. Over several weeks, Martha had carefully shaped Caroline's thinking, using a combination of fear, resentment, and rationalization. She had pointed out how many of the travelers who stopped at their cabin were themselves taking advantage of others, salesmen selling fake medicines, land speculators cheating homesteaders, men bragging about business deals that had ruined competitors. She had suggested that taking from such people was not truly wrong but rather a form of justice, redistributing wealth from those who had too much to those who had nothing. She had assured Caroline that they would only target men who were clearly dishonest themselves, who deserved whatever fate befell them. It was a gradual corruption, a slow erosion of moral principles under the constant pressure of necessity and Martha's persuasive insistence. Caroline's resistance had weakened as autumn deepened and their situation grew more dire. The garden had produced a disappointing harvest, frost coming early and killing the squash before it fully matured. 2 of their chickens had disappeared, likely taken by a fox, and the remaining hens had stopped laying as the days shortened. The sisters had almost no money left, their food stores were inadequate for winter, and the cabin needed repairs they could not afford. When Martha had finally presented her complete plan in late September, Caroline had listened with tears running down her face but had not said no. She had asked questions, raised objections, but underneath the resistance, Martha had heard the beginning of acceptance. Within a week, Caroline had agreed, telling herself they would only do this once, just enough to survive the winter, and then never again. The plan Martha had devised was simple but required Caroline's full participation. They would continue welcoming travelers as they always had, but now Caroline would actively encourage certain men to stay longer, suggesting they rest for the evening, offering meals and hospitality that would lower their guard. Martha would watch for opportunities, moments when the men were vulnerable, distracted, their weapons set aside and their attention focused entirely on Caroline. The location of their cabin provided natural advantages, the steep ravine behind the property where bodies could be disposed of, the dense forest that concealed everything, the isolation that meant no one would hear or investigate suspicious sounds. They would take only from men traveling alone, those whose disappearance might be attributed to the many dangers that claimed lives in the mountains, falls from narrow paths, attacks by wild animals, simple disorientation leading to fatal exposure. The first opportunity had arrived on October 10th, a cool afternoon when the leaves were at their peak color, painting the mountains in brilliant reds and golds that seemed to mock the darkness growing in the Garrett cabin. Samuel Thornton, a traveling salesman from Knoxville, had stopped at the cabin around 3 in the afternoon, leading a pack mule loaded with goods. He was a man in his early 40s, slightly overweight with thinning hair and a mustache waxed into points, wearing a suit that had seen better days but still marked him as someone with means. He had introduced himself with excessive friendliness, immediately commenting on how unexpected it was to find 2 lovely young ladies living alone in such isolation. His eyes had settled on Caroline with the proprietary interest Martha had learned to recognize, seeing opportunity rather than a person. Thornton had been traveling through the mountains selling kitchen goods, patent medicines, and various household items to remote families who rarely made it to town. His mule carried pots, pans, fabric, buttons, needles, bottles of cure-all tonics, and a cash box that he had foolishly mentioned contained the proceeds from several weeks of sales. He had been heading toward the next settlement but had expressed immediate interest in staying when Caroline had mentioned they might purchase some items if he would care to join them for supper. The invitation had been deliberate, rehearsed the night before, with Caroline playing her role perfectly despite the trembling in her hands that only Martha noticed. Martha had watched the scene unfold with cold calculation, observing how Thornton's demeanor changed as Caroline served him coffee and asked about his travels. The man had become expansive, boastful, describing his successful sales and the considerable sum he was carrying back to Knoxville. He had pulled out his sample case, spreading his wares across the table, pressing items into Caroline's hands and suggesting she try them, his fingers lingering on hers. He had made increasingly personal comments, complimenting Caroline's appearance, suggesting that a beautiful woman like her should not be wasting away in the mountains, offering to help her find work in the city with implications that were transparently dishonest. Caroline had played along, smiling and laughing at his stories, touching his arm when he said something amusing, while Martha had seen the fear in her sister's eyes beneath the performance. As evening fell, Martha had suggested Thornton might want to stay the night rather than risk traveling the dangerous mountain paths in darkness. She had mentioned recent bear sightings, though she had invented these, and the treacherous footing on the trails after dark. Thornton had accepted readily, clearly hoping the evening might progress in ways that benefited him. The sisters had prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and the last of their salt pork, serving it with coffee and attentive conversation. Thornton had eaten heartily, drinking the whiskey he had pulled from his pack, becoming louder and more forward as the alcohol took effect. He had begun making explicit suggestions to Caroline, offering money for her company, describing what he wanted in terms that made Caroline's face flush with shame and Martha's jaw clench with anger. Martha had excused herself after dinner, stepping out onto the porch and then circling around to the back of the cabin where their father's tools remained stored in a small shed. Her hands had shaken as she had selected the splitting maul, a heavy tool with a wedge-shaped head designed for splitting firewood. The weight of it had felt both terrible and necessary in her hands as she had tested its balance. Inside the cabin, she could hear Thornton's voice growing louder, his tone more insistent, and Caroline's nervous laughter that bordered on panic. Martha had known the moment was approaching, that they had committed to this path and could not turn back without consequences that might be worse than proceeding. When Martha had re-entered the cabin, she had found Thornton standing close to Caroline, his hands on her shoulders, his face flushed with whiskey and desire. He had barely glanced at Martha, dismissing her as irrelevant to his intentions. Caroline had looked past him to Martha with eyes that pleaded and feared in equal measure. The maul had been heavy in Martha's hands as she had approached from behind, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Every moral principle their mother had taught them, every sermon they had heard about sin and damnation, had screamed at her to stop, but the weight of desperation had been heavier than conscience. The first blow had struck Thornton at the base of his skull with a sound Martha would never forget, a wet crack that seemed impossibly loud in the small cabin. Thornton had dropped instantly, his body collapsing on Caroline, who had screamed and scrambled away. Blood had spread across the rough floorboards, dark and thick, more blood than Martha had imagined a body could hold. Thornton had twitched and made gurgling sounds that might have been attempts to speak or simply the body's involuntary responses as life fled. Martha had stood frozen, the maul still raised, staring at what she had done. Caroline had continued screaming until Martha had dropped the maul and grabbed her sister, shaking her and hissing that she needed to be quiet, that someone might hear. The next hours had passed in a blur of horror and necessary action. The sisters had stood trembling and sobbing, staring at Thornton's body as the blood pooled and spread. They had to move him, had to clean the cabin, had to dispose of evidence before morning came and the reality of what they had done became visible in daylight. Martha had forced herself to think practically, pushing down the revulsion and fear that threatened to paralyze her. She had directed Caroline to help her drag the body outside, a task made difficult by Thornton's weight and their own weakness. They had pulled him across the porch and into the darkness behind the cabin, every scrape and thud seeming impossibly loud in the night silence. The ravine behind the cabin dropped nearly 100 feet into a boulder-strewn hollow that locals avoided due to difficult terrain and dangerous footing. Martha and Caroline had dragged Thornton's body to the edge, both of them crying and shaking, then had pushed him over. The sound of the body crashing through brush and striking rocks had echoed up to them, a horrible percussion that had seemed to last forever. They had stood at the edge, breathing hard, waiting for their eyes to adjust to the darkness, but they had been unable to see the bottom or confirm where the body had come to rest. Martha had insisted they take Thornton's belongings, his mule, his cash box, everything that might connect him to their cabin, and either hide or destroy them. Cleaning the cabin had taken until nearly dawn. The blood had soaked into the floorboards, resistant to their scrubbing, leaving dark stains that they had eventually covered with a rag rug. They had burned Thornton's clothes in the fireplace, the smell of burning wool and cotton mixing with something else that had made Caroline vomit in the corner. The cash box had contained $147, more money than the sisters had seen in years, along with a gold pocket watch and a silver ring. Thornton's mule and his inventory of goods had presented a problem, too recognizable to keep, too valuable to simply dispose of. Martha had decided they would hide everything in a small cave about a mile from the cabin, a place she had discovered while foraging, and gradually sell items in different settlements far from their home. As dawn had broken on October 11th, the sisters had sat in their cabin, exhausted and traumatized, unable to look at each other or speak about what they had done. The stain on the floor seemed to glow in the morning light despite the rug covering it. Caroline had rocked back and forth, hugging herself and whimpering, while Martha had stared at the wall with dry eyes and a mind that felt simultaneously blank and screaming. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had become something they had never imagined possible, and the weight of that transformation had pressed down on them like a physical force. Yet mixed with the horror had been an undeniable relief at the money now hidden beneath a floorboard, the knowledge that they could survive the winter, that immediate desperation had been temporarily relieved. The following weeks had brought no investigation, no searching parties, nothing to suggest anyone had noticed Thornton's disappearance. The sisters had learned that he had been estranged from his family, that his business had been failing, that his route through the mountains was irregular and unpredictable. His absence had generated no alarm, just another man who had vanished into the Appalachian wilderness where death was common and often unexplained. This lack of consequence had been both reassuring and corrupting, suggesting to Martha that they had been right about the ease of their crime, that the isolation protecting them from society also protected them from justice. The money had allowed them to purchase supplies, to repair the cabin's roof, to face winter with full stomachs and warm clothes, concrete benefits that had begun to outweigh abstract moral concerns. Caroline had struggled more than Martha with the psychological aftermath. She had nightmares about Thornton, waking up screaming about blood and dead eyes staring at her. She had become jumpy, flinching at unexpected sounds, unable to look at the spot on the floor without visible distress even though the stain was covered. She had begged Martha to promise they would never do it again, that surviving the winter was enough, that they would find another way forward. Martha had made soothing promises, holding her sister while she cried, but privately she had been thinking about how much easier it would be now that they had done it once, how the second time would not carry the same shock and hesitation, how systematic they could become if they chose to continue. The second opportunity had arrived less than 3 weeks later, on a cold November morning when frost covered everything in white crystals that glittered in the weak sunlight. James Whitfield, a circuit preacher traveling between mountain communities, had appeared at the cabin seeking breakfast and perhaps a chance to conduct a brief service for the sisters. He was a lean man in his 50s, wearing a black coat and hat, carrying a Bible and saddlebags that supposedly contained only religious materials and personal items. But Martha had noticed how carefully he guarded those saddlebags, how they clinked slightly when moved, suggesting contents other than books and clothing. She had invited him in, and as Caroline had prepared breakfast, Martha had engaged him in conversation that had gradually revealed his true nature. Whitfield had indeed been a preacher at one time, but his calling had evolved into a more profitable enterprise. He traveled through isolated communities, conducting services and collecting donations with religious fervor, but he also engaged in money lending at usurious rates, taking advantage of desperate families who had no other source of credit. He had bragged about his business, apparently not seeing the contradiction between his religious position and his predatory practices, describing families he had helped while actually meaning families whose desperation he had exploited. His saddlebags had contained several $100s collected from various communities, money he planned to deposit in a bank in Knoxville while claiming the donations would support missionary work. Martha had recognized the opportunity immediately, seeing in Whitfield everything she had come to hate about the society that had abandoned them, religious hypocrisy combined with financial exploitation. She had exchanged glances with Caroline, who had looked frightened but had not objected when Martha had invited Whitfield to stay for a proper midday meal, suggesting he could conduct a service for them in the afternoon. Whitfield had agreed eagerly, clearly pleased to have a captive audience for his preaching and perhaps sensing other opportunities with two women alone. The pattern had been established now, a routine they would repeat with minor variations, and both sisters had moved through their roles with the mechanical efficiency of practice despite the sick feeling in their stomachs. The killing of James Whitfield had been easier than Samuel Thornton, the hesitation gone, replaced by a cold determination that frightened Caroline even as she participated. Martha had struck him from behind while he knelt in prayer, Caroline standing before him with clasped hands and closed eyes, playing the devout listener while her sister approached with the maul. The blow had killed him instantly, and this time there had been less blood, less mess to clean. They had disposed of his body in the same ravine, rolled him over the edge with less ceremony and more efficiency, and had hidden his horse and belongings in the same cave where Thornton's mule still waited. The saddlebags had contained $322, bringing their total to nearly $500, more money than their father had seen in his entire life. But the ease of the second killing had marked a fundamental change in the sisters, particularly in Martha. The horror had faded into routine, the moral weight had been rationalized away, and the material benefits had become intoxicating. Martha had begun to think about all the years they had struggled, all the people who had looked down on them, all the men who had made suggestions and propositions that reduced them to objects, and she had felt something like justice in what they were doing. She had convinced herself they were punishing men who deserved punishment, taking from those who had taken from others, balancing scales that had always been weighted against people like them. It was a dangerous self-deception, and Caroline had recognized it even if she could not resist her sister's stronger will. Winter had come to the Tennessee mountains with unusual severity that year of 1904, heavy snows falling throughout December and temperatures dropping well below freezing for weeks at a time. The sisters had been comfortable in their cabin for the first time in memory, the roof repaired, food stores adequate, enough firewood split and stacked to last through the coldest months. But the isolation had intensified, snowdrifts blocking the footpath and preventing travel for weeks at a time. The sisters had been alone with their secret and their guilt, the silence between them growing heavier as the snow piled higher outside. Caroline had retreated into herself, speaking less each day, her nightmares intensifying, while Martha had become harder, more calculating, already planning for spring when travel would resume and opportunities would present themselves again. Spring came late to the mountains in 1905, winter reluctantly releasing its grip as April progressed. The snow melted slowly, revealing a landscape scoured and beaten by months of harsh weather. The footpath past the Garrett cabin transformed into a muddy channel as traffic resumed, travelers eager to make up for lost time and opportunities. The sisters emerged from their winter isolation changed, Caroline gaunt and haunted looking despite adequate food, Martha carrying herself with a new hardness that neighbors found unsettling when they encountered her in the settlement. The dynamic between the sisters had shifted fundamentally during those long winter months, Martha now clearly dominant, Caroline subservient and increasingly damaged by what they had done and what Martha insisted they would continue doing. The third victim had arrived on April 23rd, a land surveyor named Edmund Price working for a timber company assessing mountain property for purchase. Price had been in his 30s, arrogant and dismissive of the sisters until he had needed their knowledge of local terrain and landmarks. He had carried expensive surveying equipment and a considerable sum of cash intended to make preliminary offers to landowners, money provided by the timber company that employed him. Martha had seen him as representing everything wrong with the changing mountains, outside interests coming to exploit local resources and people, taking what they wanted and leaving communities destroyed. The justification had been easier with Price, requiring less rationalization, and Caroline had participated with the resigned numbness of someone who no longer believed escape was possible. That Price's death had been preceded by longer planning, Martha recognizing that his disappearance might generate more investigation than previous victims. She had been careful to ensure he told no one about stopping at their cabin, had encouraged him to explore the ravine behind their property as a shortcut to his next survey point, had positioned herself so that his fall would appear accidental. The blow had come while he stood at the ravine's edge, studying his maps and compass, never suspecting the danger behind him. His body had tumbled down into the same rocky hollow where Thornton and Whitfield lay decomposing among the stones and brush, 3 bodies now hidden in that natural grave. Price's equipment and money, nearly $400, had been added to their growing cache in the cave, too much now to ever explain if discovered. Through the spring and summer of 1905, the pattern had continued with horrible regularity. Martin Hendricks, a gambler traveling between mountain towns, had stopped at the cabin in June, drunk and boastful about his winnings, treating the sisters with contempt until Martha had crushed his skull with the same maul that had killed 3 men before him. Thomas Blackwood, a traveling photographer, had arrived in July carrying expensive camera equipment and the proceeds from months of taking portraits in various settlements, his artistic sensitivity doing nothing to alert him to the danger until too late. Henry Sutton, a whiskey runner transporting illegal spirits through the mountains, had been killed in August, his death perhaps the most justifiable given his violent reputation and criminal activities, but still murder by any honest assessment. Each killing had become easier, more routine, the sisters moving through the deadly choreography with practiced efficiency. Caroline's role had crystallized into luring the men, making them comfortable and distracted, while Martha executed them from behind with brutal precision. The emotional toll on Caroline had been devastating, her personality fracturing under the weight of repeated trauma and guilt. She had stopped sleeping properly, existing in a state of constant anxiety broken by episodes of dissociation where she seemed to forget who or where she was. She had lost weight despite abundant food, her face becoming skeletal, her eyes hollow and ringed with dark circles. She barely spoke anymore except when playing her role for victims, and even then her performance had become mechanical, lacking the warmth that had initially made her effective. Martha had transformed as well, though in different directions. The killing had awakened something dark within her, a capacity for violence and manipulation she had not known she possessed. She had become cold and calculating, viewing potential victims with the detached assessment of a predator evaluating prey. The money they accumulated, now totaling several $1,000s, had meant less to her than the sense of power she derived from these acts. She had convinced herself they were superior to their victims, smarter and stronger, taking from weak men who deserved their fates. She had developed elaborate justifications for each killing, finding flaws and sins in their victims that supposedly warranted death, never acknowledging that these rationalizations served only to quiet whatever remained of her conscience. The community had begun to notice changes in the sisters during their rare visits to the settlement. Martha's eyes had acquired a hard glitter that made people uncomfortable, and her few words carried an edge of contempt that had not been there before. Caroline had become almost ghost-like, moving through the general store or church services without seeming present, responding to questions with odd delays as though translating from another language. Neighbors had commented on how strange the Garrett sisters had become, speculating about their isolation driving them mad, but no one had connected them to the increasing number of missing travelers whose disappearances had been noted throughout the region. The missing men came from different places, had been traveling to different destinations, and their vanishings had occurred at different times and locations, or so it seemed. No one suspected that they all shared a common stop, a remote cabin where 2 women smiled and offered hospitality while planning murder. By September of 1905, the Garrett sisters had killed 9 men and accumulated nearly $6,000 along with significant quantities of goods they had been gradually selling in distant settlements. 9 bodies lay in the ravine behind their cabin, some reduced to skeletons, others in various stages of decomposition, their bones intermingled among the rocks and leaves. The ravine had become a charnel pit that neither sister could look at without seeing ghosts, real only in their minds but no less present for being imaginary. The cabin itself felt contaminated, the blood stains on the floor visible only to them but seeming to spread with each killing, the very walls retaining the memory of violence and death. They had money, security, everything they had claimed to want when they started down this path, but they had no peace, no happiness, only the hollow satisfaction of survival purchased with blood. The psychological deterioration had affected their planning and execution. Martha had become increasingly reckless, taking unnecessary risks, killing men whose disappearances were more likely to be investigated. Caroline had become unreliable, sometimes freezing during the critical moments, other times breaking down immediately after the killings in ways that could have exposed them if anyone had been watching. The cave where they stored their stolen goods had become crowded with items they could never safely sell, including distinctive pieces that anyone familiar with the victims would recognize immediately. The isolation that had protected them had also trapped them in a cycle they could no longer control, the killings having become habit rather than necessity, an addiction to violence and power that Martha particularly could not break. The ninth victim, killed in early September, had been different from the others in ways that should have warned Martha to stop. Daniel Morrison had been a deputy sheriff from a county to the east, traveling through the mountains following leads on several missing persons cases. He had stopped at the Garrett cabin ostensibly seeking directions, but Martha had noticed how carefully he observed everything, how his questions seemed designed to extract information rather than simply gather navigation assistance. Morrison had been younger and more physically capable than previous victims, trained to recognize danger, armed with a revolver he kept easily accessible. Martha should have let him pass, should have recognized the elevated risk, but the compulsion to continue had overridden her judgment that Morrison's killing had been rushed and poorly executed, Martha forced to strike while he was still partially alert after he had begun asking pointed questions about travelers who might have passed through. The first blow had not killed him cleanly, and Morrison had struggled, drawing his revolver and firing a shot that had missed Martha but shattered a window. The sound had been shockingly loud, echoing across the mountains, certainly audible to anyone within a mile. Martha had struck again and again, desperate panic replacing cold calculation, until Morrison finally lay still in a spreading pool of blood larger than any before. Caroline had screamed throughout the struggle, useless and hysterical, drawing attention they could not afford. The disposal of Morrison's body had been hasty and careless, pushed into the ravine along with his horse's tack and saddlebags, but his horse had escaped in the chaos, running off into the forest with the deputy's brand visible on its flank. The Morrison killing had marked the beginning of the end, though neither sister had fully recognized it at the time. The deputy's absence had been immediately noted, his department aware of his planned route and expected return date. The gunshot had been heard by a hunter nearly a mile away, who had mentioned it to others in the settlement. Morrison's horse had been found 3 days later by a farmer, still saddled, leading to immediate concern and the organization of a search party. For the first time, real investigation had begun, focused on the area where Morrison had disappeared, and that area included the footpath past the Garrett cabin. The protective anonymity the sisters had relied upon had been compromised, attention turning toward a region where 9 men had vanished over the course of a year. The first week of October 1905 brought unseasonable cold to the Tennessee mountains, frost appearing early and heavy rains turning the footpaths into channels of mud. Inside the Garrett cabin, the sisters existed in a state of barely controlled panic, knowing that discovery was now inevitable but unable to agree on any course of action. Martha had wanted to flee, to abandon the cabin and disappear into another part of the country with whatever money they could carry, starting over where no one knew them or their crimes. Caroline had become nearly catatonic, spending hours sitting motionless and staring at nothing, occasionally rousing to beg Martha to turn themselves in, to confess and accept whatever punishment awaited them, claiming it would be better than continuing to live with the weight of their sins. The search for Deputy Morrison had expanded throughout the region. Organized teams of men combing the mountains and questioning everyone who lived along the possible routes he might have taken. On October 7th, a search party had appeared at the Garrett cabin, 6 men led by Sheriff Thomas Crawford from Morrison's county. They had asked the sisters standard questions about whether they had seen the deputy, whether they had heard anything unusual, whether they knew of any places where an injured man might have taken shelter. Martha had lied smoothly, expressing concern and offering sympathy, while Caroline had remained mostly silent, her obvious distress attributed by the searchers to appropriate worry about a missing law officer rather than guilty knowledge. The men had searched the area around the cabin superficially but had not investigated the ravine, leaving after an hour with thanks for the sisters' cooperation. But Sheriff Crawford had noticed things that troubled him, details that had not seemed significant individually but that accumulated into a pattern suggesting deeper investigation was warranted. The sisters' cabin, while remote and poor, had contained new items that seemed inconsistent with their supposed poverty. A new coffee pot, good quality blankets, store-bought clothes that should have been beyond their means. Caroline's behavior had been odd, Her inability to meet his eyes, the way she had trembled when answering simple questions, her evident relief when the search party had prepared to leave. Most significantly, Crawford had noticed that the area around the cabin was unusually clear of the equipment and supplies that should have been visible if two women were truly subsisting through their own labor, the garden plot weedy and neglected, no preserved foods visible, no evidence of the hunting and foraging that would have been necessary for survival. Crawford had returned to the county seat troubled by his observations, consulting with other law officers about the missing persons cases that had accumulated in the region over the past year. Sitting in his office, spreading maps and reports across his desk, he had begun to see a pattern he should have noticed earlier. Multiple men had disappeared along a roughly 20-mile stretch of mountain trails, all single travelers, all during the same time frame, all carrying money or valuable goods. The Garrett cabin sat nearly at the center of this disappearance zone, the most isolated residence in the area, occupied by two women whose financial situation should have been desperate but who seemed to have resources exceeding their visible means of support. The evidence remained circumstantial, insufficient for arrest warrants, but Crawford had decided he needed to investigate the sisters more thoroughly. On October 14th, Sheriff Crawford had returned to the Garrett cabin with 3 deputies, arriving at dawn without announcement. The sisters had still been in their nightclothes when the men had knocked, and Martha had known immediately that their situation had become critical. Crawford had been direct, stating that he had questions about several missing men, that he believed the sisters possessed information they had not previously shared, that he intended to search the property thoroughly. Martha had attempted to maintain her composed deception, but Caroline had broken immediately, collapsing to her knees and beginning to sob incoherently about sin and blood and bodies in the ravine. Martha had tried to silence her sister, claiming Caroline had been mentally unwell, inventing explanations for her breakdown, but the deputies had already moved to restrain both women while Crawford had begun a careful search of the cabin. The evidence Crawford had found would have been sufficient even without Caroline's confession, which had poured out in a torrent of guilt and horror once she had begun speaking. The bloodstains on the floor under the rug, still visible and clearly human in origin despite attempts at cleaning. The cache of money hidden beneath floorboards, thousands of dollars that the sisters could never legitimately explain. Personal items belonging to several missing men, a watch here, a distinctive knife there, things that should have been disposed of but that Martha had kept either as trophies or simply through failure to think of every detail. Most damning, the cave a mile from the cabin where the stolen goods had been stored, discovered after Caroline had revealed its location, containing clear evidence connecting the sisters to at least 5 of the missing men. The search of the ravine had begun immediately, deputies carefully descending into the rocky hollow while Martha and Caroline sat restrained on their cabin's porch. The first body had been found within an hour, partially skeletonized but still identifiable by clothing and personal effects as James Whitfield, the circuit preacher who had disappeared the previous November. As the day had progressed, more bodies had been discovered, 9 in total, in various states of decomposition, their positions and condition consistent with having been thrown from above. The horror of the discovery had rippled through the search party, hardened men who had seen death before but never anything approaching this scale of deliberate murder. The quiet mountain hollow had become a scene of frantic activity, men carefully documenting the evidence, photographing the bodies, attempting to identify victims and determine the circumstances of their deaths. Martha had maintained her silence even as the bodies were recovered, refusing to speak without legal representation, attempting to preserve some possibility of defense or mitigation. But Caroline had confessed to everything, her words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to unburden herself of the psychological weight she had carried for a year. She had described each killing in detail, though her account had carefully positioned Martha as the primary actor and herself as a reluctant accomplice forced to participate through fear and dependence on her older sister. She had wept throughout her confession, begging forgiveness from both God and men, claiming she had wanted to stop but had been too weak to resist Martha's domination. The deputies who had taken her statement had been moved despite their horror at the crimes, seeing in Caroline a damaged woman who had been led into evil rather than embracing it willingly. The arrest of the Garrett sisters had become immediate news throughout eastern Tennessee and beyond, newspapers carrying lurid accounts of the mountain murderesses who had lured and killed at least 9 men. The story had spread rapidly, growing more sensational with each retelling, facts becoming embellished with invented details about seduction and depravity. The sisters transformed into monsters in the public imagination. Crowds had gathered outside the jail where the sisters were held, demanding immediate justice, their anger reflecting both genuine moral outrage and the underlying misogyny that found women who killed particularly offensive to natural order. The authorities had been forced to increase security, fearing lynch mobs might attempt to extract the sisters and dispense frontier justice without waiting for legal proceedings. The trial had taken place in November of 1905 in the county courthouse, a proceeding that had attracted observers from across the state and region. The prosecution had presented overwhelming evidence of the sisters' guilt, the physical evidence from the cabin and ravine, Caroline's detailed confession, testimony from families of the victims describing their loved ones and the circumstances of their disappearances. The defense had argued that the women had acted from desperation, that their poverty and abandonment by society had driven them to crime, that Caroline had been dominated by her stronger sister and should be shown mercy. Martha had never testified, maintaining dignified silence throughout the proceedings, while Caroline had taken the stand and tearfully recounted her version of events, emphasizing her reluctance and Martha's manipulation. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts for both sisters on all counts of murder. The judge had shown no mercy in sentencing, condemning both women to death by hanging, his statement from the bench emphasizing the calculated nature of their crimes and the number of victims whose lives had been stolen. Martha had received her sentence without visible emotion, standing straight and meeting the judge's eyes, while Caroline had collapsed weeping, having to be carried from the courtroom by deputies. The condemned women had been returned to separate cells to await execution, scheduled for January 15, 1906, allowing time for appeals that everyone knew would be futile given the overwhelming evidence and public demand for justice. The final months of the sisters' lives had been spent in isolation, Martha in stoic acceptance of her fate, Caroline in desperate attempts at spiritual reconciliation. Multiple ministers had visited Caroline, attempting to provide religious comfort and facilitate confession, while she had begged them to help her understand how she had strayed so far from everything she had been taught. She had written letters to the families of their victims, apologizing and asking forgiveness, receiving replies ranging from cursing condemnation to stiff acknowledgement of her remorse. Martha had refused religious counsel, rejected attempts at spiritual preparation, spending her final weeks reading whatever books the jail provided and maintaining the hard shell she had developed during their year of killing. The two sisters had been kept separate, denied even the comfort of each other's presence, Martha forbidden from potentially exercising further influence over Caroline. That on the morning of January 15, 1906, Martha and Caroline Garrett had been hanged in the courthouse square before a crowd of several hundred people who had gathered to witness frontier justice. The execution had been managed professionally by an experienced hangman brought from another state, designed to be quick and humane despite the nature of the sisters' crimes. Martha had walked to the gallows without assistance, her face composed, speaking no final words despite being offered the opportunity. Caroline had required support from deputies, barely able to stand, whimpering prayers and apologies until the hood had covered her face. The trap had dropped simultaneously for both women at exactly 9 in the morning, their deaths instantaneous as intended, ending lives that had transformed from desperate poverty to systematic murder in less than 2 years. The aftermath of the Garrett sisters' crimes and execution had resonated through the mountain communities for years afterward, becoming a cautionary tale told to warn of the corrupting nature of desperation and sin. The cabin where they had killed had been burned by angry locals within weeks of the execution, the ravine where the bodies had been discovered becoming a place people avoided, considered cursed or haunted by the memories of violence. The few possessions recovered from the sisters had been returned to victims' families when possible, though most had been destroyed or lost. The money they had accumulated had been divided among surviving relatives of their victims, blood money that brought no comfort but at least provided some practical assistance to families who had lost their providers. The psychological complexity of the sisters' story had generated discussion about poverty, isolation, and the limited opportunities available to women in early 20th century Appalachia. Some commentators had argued that society's abandonment of the Garrett sisters after their parents' deaths had contributed to their descent into crime, that better social support structures might have prevented the tragedies. Others had rejected such mitigation, arguing that many people faced similar hardships without turning to murder, that the sisters had made conscious choices to embrace evil rather than seeking legitimate alternatives. The debate had reflected broader tensions about responsibility, morality, and the social structures that either supported or failed vulnerable populations. The victims of the Garrett sisters had been largely forgotten in the sensational focus on the killers themselves, their individual stories reduced to brief mentions in newspaper accounts obsessed with the murders rather than the murdered. Samuel Thornton, the first victim, had left behind a wife and 3 children in Knoxville who struggled with poverty and stigma after his death. James Whitfield, the corrupt preacher, had nonetheless had a congregation who mourned him despite later learning of his hypocrisies. Edmund Price, Martin Hendricks, Thomas Blackwood, Henry Sutton, and the 3 other men whose names had been recorded in trial documents had all been individuals with histories, relationships, hopes, and flaws, but they had been reduced to statistics in a story about their killers. Even Deputy Daniel Morrison, whose investigation had ultimately exposed the crimes, had been remembered more for his role in the story's resolution than for his own sacrifice. The broader context of the Garrett sisters' crimes included the harsh realities of Appalachian life in the early 1900s, the extreme poverty that afflicted the region, the isolation that left communities without effective law enforcement or social services, the limited economic opportunities that left women particularly vulnerable. The footpaths through the mountains that would later become incorporated into the Appalachian Trail had been dangerous routes where travelers frequently disappeared due to natural hazards, accidents, or predation by both animal and human threats. The sisters had exploited this environment, using the mountain's natural concealment and the region's acceptance of unexplained disappearances to hide their crimes until the scale became impossible to overlook. The execution of the Garrett sisters had marked one of the few times in Tennessee history that multiple women were hanged simultaneously, an event that generated both satisfaction that justice had been served and discomfort with the spectacle of women being publicly killed. The photograph taken of the sisters' moments before their execution had circulated widely, becoming one of the most reproduced images of frontier justice, though its publication had been controversial. Martha's composed face and Caroline's evident terror in that photograph had captured the different ways they had processed their crimes and fates, one accepting responsibility with grim stoicism, the other crushed by guilt and fear. The psychological profiles of the sisters, analyzed retrospectively by those interested in criminal behavior, had suggested different pathologies. Martha had displayed characteristics consistent with psychopathy, the calculated nature of her crimes, her lack of remorse, her ability to manipulate and deceive, her escalating violence suggesting someone whose moral constraints had been either absent or easily overcome. Caroline had appeared to be a different case, someone with intact moral sensibility who had been overwhelmed by circumstances and dominated by a stronger personality, her psychological deterioration throughout their crime spree indicating the toll that violating her own values had taken. The relationship between the sisters had been crucial to the crimes, neither likely to have killed alone, their combination creating something more dangerous than either would have been individually. The location where the Garrett cabin had stood remained empty for decades, local people avoiding the area and telling stories about ghosts and curses, the typical folklore that develops around sites of terrible crimes. The ravine where the bodies had been discovered had been carefully searched and documented by authorities, every bone and artifact recovered and catalogued, but it had taken years for the forest to reclaim the space and erase the visible signs of the death that had occurred there. Modern hikers passing through the area have no idea of the history beneath their feet, the Appalachian Trail now running within miles of where the Garrett sisters killed 9 men over the course of a single year. The story of Martha and Caroline Garrett had served as a reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within ordinary people when desperation, opportunity, and moral failure combine. They had not been monsters in the mythological sense, but rather human beings who had made terrible choices, who had allowed immediate needs to override long-term values, who had found that the first killing made the second easier and the second made the third inevitable. Their story had illustrated how isolation and poverty could create conditions where crime seemed reasonable, where victims could be dehumanized and murder rationalized. The descent from desperate women struggling to survive to calculating killers had occurred in increments, small compromises leading to larger ones, until they had become something neither could have imagined when their parents died and left them alone in the mountains. The legacy of the Garrett sisters in Tennessee history had been complex, simultaneously a cautionary tale about sin and degradation, a story about the failures of social support systems, an example of frontier justice, and a sensational narrative that reduced tragedy to entertainment. The true lessons of their story, about human nature, about the social structures that either prevent or enable crime, about the psychological processes that transform ordinary people into killers, had been largely lost in the focus on the sensational details. Over a century later, their crimes remain documented in court records and newspaper archives, a dark chapter in Appalachian history that serves as a reminder that evil is rarely as simple as it appears and that the most dangerous predators sometimes smile and offer hospitality before striking from behind. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.